Hey guys, Rafa here from the Endgame Investor, and today we're going to talk about Japan again. There's this question that's asked in the finance world about Japan. How is it possible that they can print so much money and go down the road of Keynesianism to such an extreme extent without the entire economy collapsing 10 years ago? And I don't have a specific answer to that question, but I do have a general answer to that question, and that is culture. Japan is an entirely different kind of animal.
It's an entirely different kind of flying altogether.
It's an entirely different kind of flying.
The Japanese culture is hardcore. When they decide to go in one direction, the entire country goes in that direction, and the only thing that stops them is I don't want to say. But let's put this in more financial terms and less war terms. Take a look at the Japanese stock market, Nikkei 225, and you'll understand what I'm saying. This is the Japanese stock market since 1966. And now we talk about bubbles, stock market bubbles, overvalued tech stocks, etc., real estate implosions. But look at this. We all know about this in the back of our heads, but it is truly a spectacular thing. When the Japanese do a bubble, they do a bubble. Now, from 1966 to 1965 to 1989, the Nikkei stock index went up from about 1,000 to about 40,000. And it hasn't been back at that level since then. And that was 32 years ago, 33 years ago now. Meaning when the Japanese embark on a Keynesian bubble, they do it to the extreme. And this bubble popped back in 1989 and hasn't reinflated since. So what do you think they're going to do about their bond market? They're going to buy bonds until their entire system implodes, because that's the only thing that will stop them.
What happened to the warriors at anomaly?
Dead to the last man.
Now, what caused that bubble to implode, to pop in 1989? Well, that was this. This is the Japanese money supply from around the same year, 1965 or so. Now, here's what happened in 1989 and 1990. The rate of expansion of the Japanese money supply stopped and it went to zero at around 1989, and that caused the entire bubble to implode. But if you think the Fed is extreme in its bond buying, if you think the ECB is the European Central Bank is extreme in its bond buying, you don't know Japan. Take a look at this chart. This is the distribution of Japanese government bondholders as of December 2021. Bank of Japan owns 48.1%, but it's much more now because there's been a lot of bond buying since December 2021. In fact, record amounts of bond buying. So it's over 50% now. I think it's something around 60%, and we'll get to an article about that in a second. But look what the runner-up is. Life and non-life insurance, etc., and banks at 14.4%. Now, what is happening now to Japanese bonds? The last battle appears to be ongoing now, because 2 weeks ago, the Japanese bank, the Bank of Japan, decided to raise its yield target, its yield ceiling, from 25 basis points to 50 basis points. And that has only increased volatility and pushed yields above that ceiling back last Friday. We'll look at this chart and we'll see what's going on. This back here on September 2022 is when Japanese government bond yields on the 10-year started to hit the Bank of Japan's ceiling at 25 basis points. It took from September 16th and constant knocking on that ceiling until December 19th, 2022. So September, October, November, December, about 3 months of constant knocking on that 25 basis point ceiling for the Bank of Japan to give up and move it to 50. And now, if we zoom in, see that here is the ceiling on the 50. It's been knocking up against the 50 since we have January 6th here. So right now it is January 16th. That has been 10 days, and it has already peaked above the ceiling, the 50 basis point ceiling, twice. Once on January 13th and twice on January 13th. And we are now still basically above it at 50.5 basis points. In order to keep the rate suppressed at 50 when the market is clearly pushing to move the yields higher and move Japanese government bond prices lower, the Bank of Japan has to buy trillions of yen at a time worth of bonds in order to keep the yield suppressed. At this rate, they will soon own the entire bond market. FT last week, bond traders set to test Bank of Japan ahead of key policy decision. Expectation grows among investors that Haruhiko Kuroda could scrap yield curve control measures. We'll discuss what happens when that happens in a second. Traders have warned that bond and currency markets face a week of turmoil, that's this week, as the Bank of Japan meets for the final time before a new governor is named and confronts intensifying pressure to abandon its yield curve control policy. Well, isn't that poetic? The Bank of Japan's Governor Kuroda gets one final act as Bank of Japan governor or central guy or whatever they call it there. We'll see what he's going to do. But as extreme as Japan can get in the Keynesian arena, they are still subject to the laws of nature. And while they can take it farther than the West can generally take it, eventually they fall back to earth. The two-day monetary policy meeting will take place on Tuesday and Wednesday. That's tomorrow and Wednesday, as I am recording this on Monday. In the run, markets are considering the ramifications of Japan finally moving away from the ultra-loose policies that have defined its 20-year battle with deflation and made it a global source of cheap funding. Battle with deflation. What Orwellian nonsense. The bank spent roughly 5% of Japan's gross disgusting product defending its yield target in the last month alone. 5% of the entire economy trying to preserve its yield curve control at 25 and 50 in 1 month. An analyst said the likelihood of a major announcement at this week's meeting is enhanced because Haruhiko Kuroda will step down in April after a record 10 years as Bank of Japan governor. The meeting is effectively the last opportunity to crystallize his legacy. Will he commit harakiri, or whatever the Japanese call it? I don't know. Let's see. This is the key paragraph. The central bank has spent a total of 27 trillion yen, $211 billion.
That's like saying, I want a bajillion dollars.
In record bond purchases to defend its newly set ceiling. The bank owns around half of the JGB market because of its YCC policy, yield curve control policy, which started in 2016. Citigroup economists have forecast a second scenario of the BOJ completely abandoning the yield curve control. In doing so, Kuroda would spare his still unnamed successor that task. Now I have a question. What happens to the monetary universe if and when the Bank of Japan abandons its yield curve control policy? Well, let's look back at this chart. Distribution of Japanese government bondholders as of December 2021, and we have the Bank of Japan with 48.1, which is now over half. So all of these numbers are a little bit off, but who is the second place holder of Japanese government bonds? Life and non-life insurance companies, 20.3% now. And so do you remember what happened in the UK with their own pension funds when their central bank stopped buying bonds for a little bit? Well, it was that crisis that threatened to liquidate the entire holdings of all pension funds because they were invested in some kind of leverage scheme that depended on the value of UK gilts. So what did the Bank of England have to do in response to that? They had to go back in and buy a bunch of bonds.
Banzai! Banzai!
Banzai.
Banzai!
Banzai!
Close enough.
And at that time, how much of the gilt market was owned by the insurance companies and the pension funds that were collapsing at the time? This is gilt holding distribution, UK government bonds. As of Q2 2022, 2.2 trillion pounds of central government liabilities, and how much is owned by the insurance companies and pension funds. If we go back to the time of crisis, it was 579,682,000,000 pounds. And so what is that over this? What percentage was owned by the insurance companies and the pension funds that were about to be completely liquidated because the Fed of the UK, which is the Bank of England, decided to temporarily get out of the bond market? Well, we have this number divided by that number, which is the total, and you come out with 26%. That was the crisis number that caused the entire pension fund scheme to collapse and the Bank of England to go back into the market. So what's going to happen here? I don't know exactly, but I know that Japan does Keynesianism like no other economy. And I know, just like every other time reality forces nations to change direction, it will force Japan to change direction too. And when this bomb goes off, the dominoes will fall. Will it go off immediately after the Bank of Japan announces the relaxation of yield curve control? I don't know. But at this point, anything could trigger the end game, and you've got to be ready now. You can't afford to risk one domino falling and causing the rest of everything to fall and you not being ready. It is irresponsible. The post-World War II era, monetary era, began with the end of World War II, and we know how that ended on Japan's side. Is the current fiat monetary system going to end from a reversal of that explosion on the Japanese side against the Western monetary system? It could very well be. In the meantime, bonsai. And if you enjoyed this video, sign up for a 2-week free trial of the Endgame Investor, where I go deeply into these issues and try to explain the logic behind the insanity of the world that doesn't seem to even know how crazy it is. Or you can become my patron on Patreon, where I discuss the Bible and monetary policy. Isn't that interesting? The links are in the description below. This week, we'll be discussing a massive real estate deal for gold and silver between the Israelites and the Egyptians, which led to a housing bust and oversupply as the slaves left into the desert. Konnichiwa.